Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into Aria, who honestly might just be EpicSeven's newest savior, and you may be wondering how that could be and how Aria is already an old character and how could this new EE that she's received kind of push her back into the spotlight. Well, today I'm going to show you how. So first things first, when it comes to Aria, you probably already are kind of familiar with what her kit does, but just as a quick rundown, her skill 3 provides a lot of different buffs, as you can see here. She herself receives a defense buff and a counterattack buff, while her allies are both stealth and also receive a barrier. This is really nice because, of course, if you build her with enough defense, or if you stack defense on her and you make her a bit tanky enough so that no one else can get one shot, she basically just sits there and she continuously hits you back. Now, the reason why she herself receiving a defense buff and also receiving stealth is really nice is because of her S1, which reads it attacks 2 enemies with a shadow with a 50% chance to blind, and if you counter not on your turn, you increase the chance to blind by 20%. So that means that you have a 70% chance to blind, and you pair this with the defense buff that she gets on her skill 3, she's gonna do a load of damage. And before any of that, the big kicker is that she does receive 30% crit chance for free just for existing, but also when she inevitably ends up stacking her focus bar or her resource bar to 5, she does a big AoE that does a load of damage, it dispels 2 buffs, and also pushes back by 30%. All of these scaling with defense, and all of her making the perfect storm for number 1, punishing teams that can't strip, and number 2, punishing fire units or fire units in general that want to deal damage. Now, in terms of her base stats, she does of course gain free crit chance. Her speed is decent, but again, being a mage, she does have decently high defense, which is really nice because of course her whole kit revolves around defense. But even taking aside the defense, her having 18 ER at base is pretty decent just because you're going to be stacking ER on her anyways to avoid getting stripped or remove your defense or your counterattack stance. But beyond all these things, if you do end up using Aria for something outside of specifically PvP, relish in the fact that you have a lot of free crit chance, decently high attack, and also decently high defense so that you can run something like Aria in your Wyvern PvE team. However, in terms of how you would actually use Aria in either PvP or in PvE, with PvE, like I mentioned, she's the turn 1 clearer, but in PvP currently, she is really good against meta characters like Cannaaaa, who is really strong and kind of sweeping the ladder in terms of being annoying and frustrating and doing a load of damage. But Aria also does have a pretty good time against some meta Guild War arena defenses, things that include things like Ran, primarily because a lot of the time the Ran is full damage and doesn't always have effectiveness. There are some scenarios where Ran could tag the Aria if it's a very weird looking Ran, but that's why we have the very nice green knight here, Christy, to kind of smooth or glue things together. One of the most popular Guild War offense teams to run into a bunch of teams, whether that's, again, either the Cannaaaa team or any kind of super slow, not really intimidating team, involves pretty much a Christy, a Destina, or a Rowana, and then an Aria. This team, and pretty much any team involving Aria, revolves around basically forcing up your defense, healing, or doing a bunch of damage just because, again, you kind of have this defense scaling character that also heals, and then you pair her alongside someone like Chrissy who gives a bunch of ER, and then Destina can heal. All of this to say, basically she becomes an unstoppable technical 1v3 machine, but she does have supports just in case if she gets low. That being said though, you provide a lot of protection, especially to characters like Christy and Destina, who aren't really able to get stripped by a character like, again, like Ran. And furthermore, if you are kind of bringing someone like Destina into a fire unit or a character like Cannaaaa, even better, because then Aria puts up the barrier, and although Cannaaaa wants to target Destina or the Christy, he ends up targeting the Aria instead, and pretty much just clears one-shots himself anyways. Now, of course, I do have to talk about the reason why this video is even being made, and that's because Aria not only has been buffed because of Cannaaa's appearance, but also because she literally just got buffed. They gave her an EE, and what the EE does right now is that it either gives you increased damage on your skill 1, which is your damage or main damage skill. It could also increase the damage of your skill 2 by 10%, or it could increase the total focus that you get at the start of battle. Instead, now you gain 1 additional, so in some certain scenarios, now you could get an extra proc earlier or something like that. It's kind of unknown right now how valuable the third EE is, but in terms of raw value, having 16 effect resistance and increasing the total damage that you deal with your S1 by upwards of, I don't know, maybe 20, even 30%, depending on how many times you get to activate your S1, kind of makes it the clear winner, although I could definitely argue that between the S1 and the S3, maybe there's a little bit of value there, or maybe there's some leniency. Whatever the case is, it's nice that she got the EE, and whether you want to, again, stack the damage on her S1 or her S2, that's totally fine. Her S3 is kind of untested right now. I don't really know exactly what it's for. Maybe we'll find out with something like a future Rift. Who knows? But it's a great EE, great change for Aria. Now, before we go into the actual build, what we do have to talk about is the imprint setup for Aria and whether or not it's worth it. And the honest truth is that defense percent kind of scales well with Aria. She's a mage, and she also scales specifically with defense. So you could argue that if you were to miss out on a kill, or if you were about to get one-shot by something, perhaps defense could be good. And even in some cases, you could argue that defense percent not only acts, again, as her damage, but also as her survivability. So as opposed to another character, maybe like a Spectre Tenebria, whose imprint is attack and doesn't really affect whether or not she survives, Aria has a dual purpose imprint where it not only gives you more defense, it also increases your damage. That being said though, since she is an RGB, her imprints are definitely not insanely valuable. There are whales or dolphins or low to high spenders that'll definitely argue that getting Aria imprints are really nice, especially if you're trying to hit something like 2000 defense, the point where you can't kind of just get one shot by like a Karina or like a stray S1 from a character. But we are talking about a character right before an Overlord collab. So in terms of value, if you get her, great, use her imprints, that's very nice. However, I would definitely not recommend specifically story summoning for her or to get more imprints of her. If you want one copy of her, I understand the value is there, especially because of how prominent Cannaaaa is right now and how annoying it is to deal with him. I can understand wanting to get her, but outside of that, do not pull for any more imprints. Kind of a waste. Now, you probably have seen it a couple times, or if you didn't already notice it, this is the current build that I have for my Aria, and although it is a little bit outdated and you could argue whether or not you want something like immunity or a crit set or whatever set ends up working for you, something that I definitely want to point out about my build is that I have 100 effect resistance specifically for my purposes because I like using book, and I like using the book that I pair on my Aria to sometimes get her out of sticky situations, whether it's being reset or whether it's sometimes pairing her alongside someone like Spectre Tenebria in order to get another 20 souls and then kind of wreak havoc on things. It's really cool. It's very helpful. And for me, I find that having 100 effect resistance is normally enough so long as I pair her with someone that has a spread ER imprint, aka someone like Crimson Armin, a Fallen Cecilia, etc. Or, of course, the most common pairing of her is with Christie. That being said, though, I do like the value of the book, and like I mentioned before, if you ever are fighting against someone that has a one-turn reset, i.e. someone like, I don't know, a knock wall, and you accidentally get hit, you can always soul burn out of it, and then you can reset your cooldown, and it's not that big a deal. But I can definitely see the value in either increasing her ER to 130 so that you could put something on like Bastion, and then giving yourself 200 ER and making yourself a little more, I guess, foolproof against characters like Conqueror Lilius or other high effectiveness characters. Or you could even lower this amount and put it to something like 60 and then gain the additional stats and remove the book entirely. Now, in terms of sets, there isn't really an argument specifically for the PvP Aria, which is the one that I'm currently using, outside of basically choosing between using crit set, immunity set, or something like that. A kind of minor argument whether you want to keep immunity so that you can sometimes avoid dealing with someone like Lua if you have barriers, or basically if you're just trying to use crit set because you have better crit set than you have resist set. But for PvP, you are almost always going to be using lifesteal, unless if you're running a very fast Aria, one that's speed and kind of just doesn't heal, but kind of makes everyone blind and gives you a barrier to your allies. Even though that is a potential build, however, that specific speed build hasn't been used literally since her launch. And since then, everyone has basically swapped to this lifesteal, decent damage, and also tankiness variation. Okay, now earlier I did talk about how Tag of Hells was really good for her in terms of artifact, and you may even end up using something like the Bastion of Hope, which is pretty popular just because it gives you 70 effect resistance. However, there is also a couple other choices that you could choose when it comes to having decent value, whether that's in Guild War, Arena, etc., or even PvP. But those two additional choices that I would say kind of stand out in being pretty decent is number one, Proof of Valor, because there are a lot of people who have recently kind of just tried to run the damage into the Aria and one-shot the Aria with their Cannaaaa, which is absolutely bonkers, by the way, but You know what, if you're afraid of your Aria getting one shot, I could definitely see value in having Proof of Valor and just making sure that you don't get one shot. But I did also want to bring awareness to using Fairy Tale for a Nightmare, not just on Aria, but almost maybe even on Politis. The main reason for this is, as you read, it says after an extra attack, counter attack, or dual attack, you have a 60% chance to dispel one buff from the target, which is fine, but you also have a 100% chance to deal 1500 fixed damage, assuming that you're maxed to your enemy. Now, the reason why this is pretty important is not because it does 1500 damage, although that is really nice, especially if you're running this artifact specifically on Solitaria, but rather because now if a Cannaaaa ends up proccing, he doesn't get to live with literally 0 HP. If you are running Aria specifically to fight against Cannaaaa, and you have Fairy Tale for a Nightmare, this additional fixed damage will go off as soon as he gets activated, and instead of activating and using plan B and then being able to survive for one extra turn, he just gets popped on the spot. No opportunity for him to go back into stealth or heal up. He's just gone. And that's especially good value if your whole point of picking Aria is to beat up one specific character. Just do it for free with this artifact. Okay, now I know I already kind of spoiled whether she's good for Arena or PvP or PvE in general, but to kind of reiterate what I've already mentioned, she's definitely really good right now for both RTA, Guild War, and Arena just because of how prominent, like I mentioned before, Cannaaaa is. However, she's already been kind of a mainstay when it comes to Guild War offense teams because, like I mentioned, there's nothing more broken than an Aria that can't be stripped and having a character like Destina or Christie kind of hiding within her shields. That being said though, in other scenarios that aren't just Wyvern and PvP, you could definitely see value in a character like Aria. In a couple of the Nightmare Raid certain bosses or even in Hell Raid, she's kind of an insane character just because she provides so much utility, again with her stealth and the shields, and I've even heard a couple of Abyss stages being used with her, which is really nice because she's just a solo queen. You just kind of throw her out there, everyone gets protected, and GG. Courtesy of both Prof Boy and Tristan's video, who I'm using for the footage right now, as you can see, we have a Sinful Angelica that powers up an Aria, and Aria actually acts as a pretty good Wyvern 13 turn 1 kind of, I guess, like AoE minion clearing kind of debuffer, damage dealer. I don't know what this penguin is going on here, but the penguin does a lot of damage, or whatever the penguin king is, does a load of damage. And of course, Aria can get one shot here. It doesn't matter. She does, you know, you usually do at least one debuff, which is really nice. But then it sets you up for a number of cleaves, whether that's the Karen Angelica cleave, if that's the Rem cleave, whatever it is. In some cases, you do want the AoE to continue or persist, or, you know, you may want Aria to continue doing damage. But even in its worst case scenario, Aria presents herself as one of the lowest investment budget AoE clearers for Wyvern 13's first wave, just because, again, you can't really get through her. She gets a defense buff, which gives her additional damage. It kind of acts like a pseudo damage buff akin to giving attack buff to someone, but it's technically defense because she scales on defense. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anyways, she gains a load of stat for free. She does a lot of damage in the first wave, and because of her new EE that boosts not only her S1 damage on the actual effect, but also gives her effect resistance, this makes her really good not only for PvE, but also for PvP. Okay, now this next section about synergies is a little bit weird because, in all honesty, Aria is not a character that you kind of build an entire composition around. Aria is a counter or specifically reactionary pick that you use to counter fire characters or teams that don't have an answer to, again, stripping or kind of an unstrippable character that can just blow up your whole team. Proof of the reason why synergies and kind of the whole idea behind her synergizing with one specific character is a little bit weird is because the far right panel right there is showing specifically what Aria synergizes with, and if you take a look at the left, it shows the characters that she specifically counters. None of these really make sense because that would mean that not only does she counter Conqueror Lilius and Laia, she also synergizes really well with them. It's definitely weird and doesn't really make too much sense, but in terms of the reason why it shows off like this, the message that they're trying to describe, you are pretty much going to be pairing her with anyone at any time, and assuming that you are able to, again, pick her as a 5th or 4th pick against a fire unit or a team that has no strips, she's gonna do really well. And the only thing that you should really take away from the counter or synergy section of this Match History GG site is that Cannaaaa is right there for a good reason. That is exactly who she's designed to kill right now. Now, this is typically the section of the guide where I talk about whether or not she's a must pull or if you should specifically story summon her, but the answer is always going to be no, because she's not a limited character, she's not a collab unit, and furthermore, she's a pretty old character. At this point, Aria has been out for a decent amount of time, and if you don't have her already, you're probably surviving. But that being said, I would definitely be lying if I didn't say that I found a lot of people recently using her, specifically, again, because there aren't as many strip characters outside of ML Politics that are being used, or high enough effectiveness characters that can deal with the Aria. And furthermore, when you are already out of options and you don't have anything to deal with the strongest fire DPS in the game in the form of Cannaaaa, you're definitely going to find yourself reaching for an Aria or a water character in general that can deal with the Cannaaaa. And unfortunately right now, the only two answers that you can maybe argue are really good for dealing with Cannaaaa is Cannaaaa, which is already kind of 50-50, because if he ends up one-shotting you or just running the 50-50 into your Cannaaaa, she just gets one-shot and dies. But Aria is a little bit different because not only does she have defense buff and she can strip him at the same time, it's a bit of a different ball game. I think Aria is definitely one of the best answers to the strongest DPS in the game right now. But even with that being the case, I don't think she's worth force summoning, especially with the Albedo and Shaltier banners coming up. Collab will definitely take precedence. You could wait for this on the banner. Just enjoy, I guess, getting one shot by Cannaaaa in the meantime. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so I did want to kind of go over a bit of a match where I found that one of the specific focus increase EEs was actually really nice, specifically for dealing with somewhat of a cleave. Now, in the scenario that we have right here, there's a Moon Bunny, there's a Death Dealer, there's a Laya. Now, although the Laya and the ML Politics were able to outspeed the Moon Bunny team, which arguably or maybe not arguably was supposed to go first. And even though, again, ML Politics had to proc and then the Politics was able to push up and stuff, the Aria actually ended up having the one additional focus EE, which is actually really important because as you can see right here, the Moon Bunny was eventually able to take her turn. But in this specific case, because the Cannaaaa ended up going ahead, the Aria was able to proc literally on this turn. And without the one focus EE, you would literally just be stuck here. You know, maybe the Sid could take a turn, or maybe you could one-shot with the Sid immediately after if you didn't blind. But because of the EE and the newly buffed, I guess, change to her, in this exact situation, the entire team just gets one-shot. And as you can see here, the Cannaaaa ends up doing his best, doing an S3, doesn't end up killing, but the S2 ends up going off from the Aria. The big AoE kind of strips, pushes back everyone. And then from this point on, I mean, take a look at this, right? Even with the Cannaaaa proccing, he's got the Politics that's going to take a turn. His Politics, not the Fire Politics taking the turn. And it's kind of lights out from there, right? You know what I mean? So at this point, you deal with the Sid or you get to push off. The Sid doesn't really do enough damage because he's lost his attack buff. Nothing else really matters. And look, it's on Proof of Valor, so the game is over. Now, although this wasn't the most ideal Aria scenario, there is a bit of a disclaimer that I want to make when it comes to Aria matches or being able to show off Aria matches. If Aria is in your game, in 99.99% of cases, you've already won. Because again, like I mentioned previously, Aria is a reactionary or a counter pick. If you're picking her, it's in response to a character like Cannaaaa. And if they leave Aria in, especially when there's a Cannaaaa in the match, in most cases, you'll just end up soloing the Cannaaaa and his whole entire team. Okay, but as I'm sure you could tell, guys, Aria is really strong. She has pretty low stat investment. All you really need is a lifesteal set so that you can lifesteal, and if you end up using her in something like Wyvern or any PvE, you could definitely forego some of the stats or the sets and kind of just use whatever you need to in order to clear whatever content you're looking to get. Ultimately though, guys, I think that Aria is really good. I do think that if you have her, you should build her like I mentioned before. Wouldn't pull on her specifically because I'm already kind of dry in bookmarks. But anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this guide. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. I've heard a lot of your guys' feedback. Hopefully this is the format that we'll stick on. If there's anything that you guys think I should add, feel free to let me know. However, again, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks again for everyone who's been supporting or watching or letting me know any feedback, anything in between. Thanks again. I'll see you guys on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.